To begin my presentation this afternoon by talking about what I think is the most important issue in language education, the most important question, and that is, how do we acquire language? And I'd like to begin this discussion, this presentation, with an outrageous statement. In my opinion, we all acquire language the same way. The reason this is an outrageous thing to say is that these days in education, we're living in an age of individual variation. We're very concerned about how our students are different, not how our students are the same. Those who've been around in the field for a while remember, about 15, 20 years ago, people were very concerned about something called field-dependent learners and field-independent learners. You give people a certain test and one group gets this treatment, one group gets the other. Then about 15 years ago, it was left side of the brain, right side of the brain. Some people are left hemisphere thinkers, some people are right hemisphere. Then about 10 years ago, cognitive style. The cognitive style of the home culture differs from the cognitive style of the school culture. We have a clash, etc. Well, each of the examples I gave you is probably correct. There is individual variation, and there is quite a bit of it. Nevertheless, there are some things we all do the same. Let me give you some examples. Digestion. We all digest food the same, no significant individual variation. First you put it in your mouth, then you chew it up, then it goes down your throat, then into your stomach. That's how it's done everywhere. That's how it's done in North America, South America, Europe, Asia, Africa. That's how it's done everywhere in the world. The visual system's the same everywhere. It's always the occipital lobe in the back of the brain. It's never in the side of the brain. It's never in the front of the brain. It's never in the elbow. It's done exactly the same everywhere you go. By the way, I used to use sex as an example of things everyone does the same, but some counterexamples have been pointed out to me recently. Actually, I saw this movie, if you really want to know the truth. Anyway, we all acquire language the same, and rather than just talk about it, I'd like to show you. I'd like to take just a couple of minutes and give you some sample language lessons. I'll use a language that I'm sure you've heard before, and maybe some of you speak, and you can tell me which of these two very brief lessons you like better. Here's lesson number 1. Wir werden jetzt anfangen, Deutsch zu lernen. Und ich möchte im Voraus sagen, dass nach meiner Meinung Deutsch ist eine sehr schöne Sprache. Und ich hoffe, dass Sie alle sehr viel Erfolg mit Deutsch haben werden. What do you think? Good lesson so far? Do you think if I kept talking to you like that, you'd pick up German? Not very likely. How about if I repeated it? Would that help? Probably not. How about if I said it louder? Would that help? Probably not. How about if I said it and you repeated it back? Again, I don't think that would help. How about if I wrote it out for you and you could see it on your television screen? That wouldn't help either. How about if I wrote it out for you and you copied it down? How about if I wrote it out for you and deleted every 5th word and you tried to guess what the word is? The truth is that none of these things help. None of these things mean anything, and I hope you can see that now. Here's lesson number 2. And for this, you have to watch me carefully. Das ist meine Hand. Verstehen Sie das? Hand? Everyone say, ja, I can hear you, even though it's a TV audience. Good. Kopf. Das ist mein Kopf. Verstehen Sie Kopf? Ja? Gut. Kopf. And here I'll draw a picture now. Kopf. Ist gut, ja? Schön. Kopf. Das ist Mr. Spock, ja? Mr. Spock hat 2 Ohren. Ohren. Verstehen Sie Ohren? Er hat 2 Ohren. Okay, Mr. Spock. Ja? Ach, nein. Entschuldigung. Okay. Augen. Verstehen Sie Augen? Augen. Wie viele Augen? 1, 2, 3 Augen. 3 Augen. Ist das richtig? 3 Augen? Nein. Wir haben nur 2 Augen. Mund. Verstehen Sie Mund? Und hier ist eine Zigarette, ja? Nein. Zigaretten sind nicht gut. If you understood lesson number 2, not every word, but more or less, I did everything necessary to teach you German. And now I'm going to share with you the most important thing I have learned about language. Probably the best kept secret in the profession. We acquire language in one way and only one way, when we understand messages. We call this comprehensible input. We acquire language when we understand what people tell us, not how they say it, but what they say, or when we understand what we read. Comprehensible input, in my opinion, has been the last resort of the language teaching profession. We've tried everything else. We've tried grammar teaching, drills and exercises, computers, etc. But the only thing that seems to count is getting messages you understand, comprehensible input. Now, one of the reasons lesson number 2 was better than lesson number 1 is we had Mr. Spock to help us out. So anything that helps make input comprehensible, pictures, knowledge of the world, realia, etc., helps language acquisition. If comprehensible input is true, what we call the input hypothesis is true, other things follow from it. And a very important corollary of the input hypothesis is this, and this may come as a bit of a surprise to some of you. Certainly came as a surprise to me. Talking is not practicing. Talking is not practicing. What does this mean? It means if you want to improve your Spanish, it will not help you to speak Spanish out loud in the car as you drive to work in the morning. It will not help you to go to the bathroom, close the door, and speak Spanish to the mirror. I used to think those things help. Now I think they don't. On the other hand, if we were a German class and we could hang together for a couple of weeks, say an hour a day of German, and I could keep the input light and lively, as in the second example, you'd start to acquire German. It would come on its own. And eventually, you'd start to talk. Your speaking ability would emerge gradually. Now, we have a lot of evidence that this is true, and the evidence is in the professional literature, in books, in journal papers, etc. And if you're an insomniac, you're welcome to look at all that. I'd like to discuss one more hypothesis before we move on to literacy, and this is a very important one called the affective filter hypothesis. Research in language acquisition has concluded that there are several factors that relate to success in language acquisition, and I'm going to list them here on your screen. One factor is motivation. Students who are more motivated do better in language acquisition. Those of you who study this know that it's a little more complicated than this, but this is a good approximation. Second, self-esteem. Probably the dominant concept today in popular psychology. Students with more self-esteem, more self-confidence do better in language acquisition. Third, anxiety. And here the correlations are negative. The lower the anxiety, the better the language acquisition. In fact, my hypothesis is for language acquisition to really succeed, anxiety should be 0. This has happened to you. Have you ever been in a situation, speaking a language that you may not speak very well, when the conversation gets so interesting, you temporarily forget that you're using another language? If this is happening to you, that's when you're acquiring. When your focus is completely on the message, what the other person is saying, and your anxiety is temporarily gone. Frank Smith puts it this way. For the child to develop literacy, the child has to assume that she's going to be successful. The way we integrate this into the theory is like this. If the student isn't motivated, if self-esteem is low, if anxiety is high, if the student is on the defensive, if the student thinks the language class is a place where his weaknesses will be revealed, he may understand the input, but it won't penetrate. It won't reach those parts of the brain that do language acquisition. A block keeps it out. We call this block the affective filter. Here's how it works. Somewhere in the brain, Chomsky tells us, is a language acquisition device. Our job is to get input into the device. So that's input here. Low motivation, low self-esteem, high anxiety, the block goes up, the filter goes up, and the input cannot get in. This explains how it can be that we can have 2 children in the same class, both getting comprehensible input. One makes progress, the other doesn't. One is open to the input, the other's closed. Let me now try to summarize everything I've said in the last 10-15 minutes or so, and I'll summarize it in one sentence, and we'll wonder why it took me that long. We acquire language in one way, and only one way, when we get comprehensible input in a low anxiety environment.